see where we are with those folks. I see there's Mark. Long time no see. Yeah, Mr. Gallagher.
What's going on?
I made my crayon joke earlier, so I got it out of my system.
Yeah,
So panel number 3.
Material here.
Oh, you're noticing that I have shaved.
It looks good. Looks good.
I appreciate that. I did not forget your kind comments at Hack the Capital 3.0 on my aesthetics.
Well, I aim to be kind, if nothing else.
So panel number 3, Industrial Control Systems and the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission. Now this is really neat because we have a bunch of big players from it. Moderated by Mark Montgomery, who is the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation and a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He serves as the Senior Advisor to the Chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and was previously the Executive Director. Prior to this, he was Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John S. McCain, and completed 32 years as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. And with that, go Army, beat Navy.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Bryson. And I'm really proud to be here with two of the commissioners from the commission, so a little home cooking, I think. But a really good opportunity to talk about where the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was, what happened last year with ICS and ITC issues, and then where we think we're headed this year, with the reauthorization of the committee in the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act. And I hope at some point near the end we can talk about why the commission was probably more successful than most at getting some legislation done, and how that can be used to push forward legislation on ICS, OT, and ICT issues. And I'm going to try to figure out a few more acronyms I can throw in there over the next 15 minutes. And the good news is I have two panelists with me that absolutely know all the acronyms. We've now spent 42 meetings together, 42 formal meetings, legal meetings, and then hundreds of side meetings trying to work this issue, and I believe we have come to a broad-based bipartisan position on almost all cyber issues, which really is a pleasant experience. We had a meeting yesterday, in fact, where we took a challenging issue and were able to talk through it and get to broadly bipartisan solution. So a real pleasure. Well, I want to start first with Representative Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin. I should mention he's a Marine, and we won't hold that against him throughout the whole scenario here, but he certainly would support Navy against Army, I'm sure. He does have he has a PhD, and I found out very early on an expert on the Eisenhower Solarium Commission, which kind of took the wind out of my sails on giving historical examples. But as chairman of the commission, he and Senator Angus King really gave us our direction, and I think deserve a lion's share of the credit for our ability to get legislation done, along with the speaker in the next hour, Representative Jim Langevin. I think the three of them really allowed us to get a lot of work done, and I think Representative Gallagher probably agreed with me on that. But let's start with a basic question. Can you give us a short review of what the Solarium Commission did in 2020, including why you think it's been successful?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark, and I think you deserve a lion's share of the credit, as do all our commissioners, including Dr. Ravitch, for just the amount of time and effort you put into this. I mean, it's easy for these commissions to kind of go off the rails or just produce a report that nobody reads and collects dust, and we kind of went into this not only studying the past experience of other outside commissions, what they did right, what they did wrong, but also really trying to think about what was unique about the makeup of our commission and how we could leverage that to our advantage. So just briefly to review, the commission was created by the 2019 NDAA to develop a bipartisan strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequence. We had 14 commissioners that included 4 legislators from Congress, 4 senior executive agency leaders, and 6 nationally recognized experts from outside of government, i.e. Dr. Ravitch. So this was a very unique structure and membership that provided the commission with a broad base of expertise, a lot of insights that we use to identify, assess, and make recommendations to improve the interagency and public-private partnership essential for protecting our political system, our critical infrastructure, our innovation base. And in March 2020, in what I think was the last public event in Congress before everything shut down, the Commission released a public report detailing a comprehensive strategic approach with 82 policy recommendations, 52 of which were legislative for implementation. We also published 3 additional white papers on the pandemic, the implications of the pandemic on cybersecurity, the workforce, and supply chain. And we had a lot of success based on the bipartisan nature of the commission and the fact that we developed comprehensive legislative provisions for every proposal. We didn't just sort of vaguely recommend Congress should do something. We actually took the time to craft legislative language. And then we used the 4 legislators, particularly Jim Langevin, who was in a critical position on the Armed Services Committee, on the Cyber Subcommittee, in order to get a lot of those bills passed into law. And I think we can say that we passed the most significant piece of cyber legislation in American history with last year's National Defense Authorization Act. So that being said, our work is not done. In some cases, we've only just begun, and we still exist for another year. And so we're trying to evaluate the past work we did, as well as look at the legislative proposals we weren't able to get across the finish line and try and get them through in this Congress. And at a time when Congress is divided, it's been refreshing to see that at least on this issue, there's a great deal of bipartisanship.
Hey, thanks, Representative Gallagher. I appreciate it. Now to introduce our second panelist with Dr. Samantha Ravitch, as you mentioned, a commissioner on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, also the chairman of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and just recently vice chairman of the President's Intel Advisory Board, and just now named an inaugural member of the Secret Service's Cyber Investigations Advisory Board. So has a lot of experience in all the different elements of the interagency process looking at cyber. Samantha, Representative Gallagher mentioned the white papers and the kind of extensive work we did after the March 2020 report. I think one of the white papers has the most synergy with the ICS issue, and that is the white paper on information communications technologies supply chain. Can you get into some detail about why the CSE went on to tackle this issue independently and what became of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for being here. And again, yeah, echoing Mike's kudos to you, Mark. Yeah, so, and also you mentioned PIAB and now the Secret Service. So I know it's just us 3 on the phone, not recording, no one else is listening, but Solarium was the best. I mean, Cyber Solarium, the best commission ever been on, best people. So yeah, just keep it amongst us. So you mentioned information and communications technology, that our supply chain white paper, and I know that this panel is focused on industrial control systems, but we actually did see them as part and parcel, right? Because if we don't get the information communication systems piece of all of this right, and there's a lot of flow back and forth, I mean, it really is in some ways the bedrock for the technology that then powers, no pun intended, part of the industrial control systems and what that it means for our safety and security, our health and prosperity. So back in October of 2020, we released the ICT supply chain paper, and we really put it in the most blunt language possible that the US must take steps to reduce critical dependencies on untrusted information and communications technologies. And the paper, it's very readable, and we concisely went through the risks and challenges we are currently facing in this space, and recommended that we must have an ICT industrial base strategy. And we said, quote, to ensure more trusted supply chains and the availability of critical information and communications technologies. So we called out a few things. First of all, we called out the confusion created inside the US government by a number of disparate, largely disconnected actions, including several executive orders, as well as the who's on first in terms of the interagency lead, right? Department of Homeland Security, Commerce, NIST, DOD, Department of State, name your favorite agency. And we really thought that the lack of coherent and cohesive overarching strategy to secure America's ICT supply chains runs the risk of encouraging inefficient uses of time, resources, money, and ultimately undermining the very purpose behind the fragmented efforts. So then we also stepped back and said, but it's not just a government endeavor. Where does the private sector fit in on this? Because it's the private sector where innovation lies, where the products are being made, marketed, where really the future is being written. So the white paper recommends that a specific strategy to build a trusted supply chain for critical ICT must do the following things. Identify key technologies and equipment, because not everything is tier one. I think, you know, at Solarium, we understood this in our DNA, that if you try to do everything, try to protect everything, it's not going to work. You have to kind of belly up to the bar and you have to say, yeah, there are priorities. So making choices is probably the most difficult part of the work. The second is ensuring minimal viable manufacturing capacity through strategic investment. Again, making choices. Where has the private capital market not sufficed, right? But this also means ensuring that the US government has the right people with the right qualifications to even begin assessing it and analyzing where do we need to put money from the taxpayer's pocket into the private sector to ensure minimum viable manufacturing capacity. Third, protecting supply chains from compromise through better intel, info sharing, and product testing, and I'll get back on that in a little bit. Fourth, stimulating a domestic market through targeted infrastructure investment and ensuring the ability of firms to offer products in the US similar to those in foreign markets. So let me put this specifically. It means awareness, right? Like I would love to buy a smartphone not made in China. But A, how do I even know whether my smartphone or what components are made in China? I have no idea, right? And I'm pretty good at all this stuff. And two, even if I knew, do I have a choice? What are the choices? Again, have no idea. So notable recommendations include stimulation of domestic critical technology manufacturing through a mix of government initiatives, including significant investment in R&D, the creation of a public-private national security investment corporation to serve as a clearinghouse to connect latent private investment to investment opportunities relevant to national security. Again, not everything. You have to focus on the priorities. And the creation of a national supply chain intelligence center, which I hope we'll get to talk a little bit more later, because I think it's critical to this whole effort. So back to you, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Samantha. That's a great review, and kind of, I know we focused on the white paper on ICT supply chain, but we were thinking about both operational technology, OT, and ICS and SCADA issues while we worked on that. But and frankly, we probably were a little weaker on the software when we were thinking about that. And in fact, 4 months later, or 3 months after we published it, the kind of the totality, the comprehensiveness of the SolarWinds came clear and reminded us that beyond hardware, there's a significant software chain there. So when for Representative Gallagher, what's the kind of threat we're thinking about when we talk about this group of issues about our OT equipment, our ICS equipment, our SCADA, our ICT equipment? What's the threat we're kind of most thinking about when we're at the commission?
Well, to put it bluntly, in the context of supply chains for ICT, the United States has a China problem, a big China problem. Over the past 2 decades, China has mobilized state-owned and state-influenced companies to grab a dominant position in markets for several emerging technologies, including the market for telecoms equipment. And it isn't an accident, but rather it's a result of a concerted strategic effort by the Chinese government to capture these markets through a mix of government-led industrial policy, unfair and deceptive trade practices, including state-led intellectual property theft, the manipulation of international standards and trades bodies, and a growing network of influence that's built on the back of diplomatic and trade negotiations, as well as their own significant investments in R&D for ICT. R&D for ICT, how's that for an acronym, Mark? There you go. But as a result, the critical strategic competition between China and the US and its friends and partners is taking place in an international system of commerce that, because of Chinese state intervention, is neither free nor fair, and it's hampering the ability of American and partner companies to compete for global market share. So while our primary competitor in this space, China, has a comprehensive strategy demonstrated by Made in China 2025, Civil Military Fusion, China Standards 2035, we in the United States lack an overarching vision for how to compete with China on this front. We've had a myriad of activities, from congressional proposals like the American Foundries Act, the CHIPS Act, the U.S. Telecom Act, and some executive branch initiatives that have been run out of DHS, state, DoD, commerce, and elsewhere. But we seem to lack a coherent and comprehensive national strategy to align these efforts in partnership with key allies and partners in the private sector. So in short, I think in our eagerness to do something about a very apparent challenge, we've sort of leapt to action without an overarching plan. I'm co-chairing, in addition to Solarium, a supply chain vulnerability task force on HASC, and I think we're really looking at the past year of the pandemic and some of the ways in which we woke up to the fact that, advanced pharmaceutical ingredients were produced in China, and that gave them leverage to threaten us, to cut off exports, to plunge the United States into a sea of coronavirus, and thinking, well, that's unacceptable, and we need to invest some money here domestically to ensure that our supply chains are more resilient. And that's certainly true when it comes to ICT technology.
If I can ask one question on that task force, is that also a bipartisan group, and do you think that it has an opportunity for producing significant legislation?
It is bipartisan. My co-chair is Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat from Michigan, who in her state saw the supply chain disruptions to the automotive industry, as well as, she tells kind of the story of where we were a year ago at this time, kind of, getting all these inquiries as a member of Congress from people saying that they, knew someone who had a plane full of masks and this and that, and it was just kind of a very chaotic situation. Really realizing that what we thought was in the stockpile was not adequate, finding single points of failure like the lack of testing reagent. We were trying to dramatically increase testing, but it is a very bipartisan effort that reflects the composition of HASC itself. But in contrast to Solarium, we have a much shorter window of time. We don't have outside experts, so we're trying to produce a very small report that in some ways is taking and stealing a lot of the good ideas that are already out there and thinking, okay, what can we inject into this year's NDAA process in order to make an impact in the short term? So I would expect our final work to be a little bit smaller and shorter than the Solarium final report, a little bit less comprehensive, and really just kind of a blueprint for short-term action.
Thanks, I appreciate that. It's interesting. The NDAA, I mean, there's always a joke that you could probably, get a rainbow unicorn cleared through the NDAA, but in last year's NDAA, it really did become a national security authorization, with a lot of homeland security, foreign affairs, in foreign relations or foreign affairs in the House, along with the traditional armed services. And I know it has always done that a little bit, but last year really reached a peak on that. And in fact, there's been a couple studies done at Third Way and a few other think tanks about the propensity of cyber legislation, particularly at the national security level, through the NDAA. So I hope your task force is as successful as Solarium at that. Speaking of last year's legislation, I think I'd ask Dr. Ravitch here, and it's hard, ICS, ICS, OT, kind of some of the SCADA systems. Some of our legislation didn't always go down deeply to the tactical level, but were some of our legislation last year, do you think they tackled kind of ICS or OT equipment in a meaningful way?
Yeah, we did. Two specific pieces of legislation I'll talk about in a second, but I just want to kind of reiterate something that was just said about, non-traditional. That last year's NDAA was thought about in a way that maybe hadn't been in the past, because we finally, have woken up to the fact that, you can't draw a bright and shiny line between what's happening over there and what's happening here, more so than ever because of our systems, because we are so interconnected, literally, with the technology that we need that's coming out overseas, from potential adversarial nations, and how they can get in even what we build here. So you're absolutely right. Tradition in this respect just will not be good enough. In terms of what specific pieces of legislation, let me call out two. One is on sector risk management agencies, which seeks to strengthen government agency roles and responsibilities, specifically, on underserved sectors. It gets at one of the problems that I spoke about earlier: who does what, right? Who's in charge of what, who does what? And meanwhile, certain underserved sectors, and we'll get to that hopefully in a minute, are left saying, who's here to help us through all of this? So the sector risk management agencies, it discusses who's going to be in charge of managing ICS risk for each respective sector, as well as cyber incident response, management, coordination in the event of an attack against ICS. So this brings us to another very large piece of legislation and important, which is continuity of the economy, right? And the whole underpinning of all of this is we have been attacked, we will continue to be attacked, but what do we do in the event of the big attack, right? The big attack across industrial control systems, as well as other systems, that rolls across our economy. Doesn't actually just go to, one sector, but it's on finance and electricity and transportation and communications. Have we thought through the plan for recovery? This kind of stems, Mike Gallagher is the master on the history of this, but when we look at continuity of operations, continuity of government, what we had to do and still do test during the Cold War. So if the Soviets came at us big time, we would be able to stand up the next day and respond. Right, and not only do we need that to recover for our country, but it's a plank of deterrence. The adversary absolutely needs to know we have the wherewithal to get up the next day if they try to attack our critical infrastructure and impose costs and penalties upon them. So continuity of the economy is critical for being able to do this. It does in many things. It calls for a number of areas, and it needs to be appropriated for, but it's required to define ways to keep ICS technologies resilient in the event of a significant cyber event, but also identify areas where we may need to go to analog or non-digital backups to ICS equipment. And whenever I talk about this piece of it, I have to give a shout out to our commissioner, the great Tom Fanning from Southern Company, who kind of schooled us all on this, on the need to have that big red lever that in the event of such an attack can be pulled, that not everything is digital, that we have the wherewithal if we need. But it goes to prioritization, continuity of the economy. Not everything is tier one, not everything has to be brought back on immediately. The same types of equipment that we need to hold in reserve might go to many different sectors, many different industries within those sectors. We need to have a prioritization of who gets what when, if there is a significant attack, and have that in place prior. That is one of the greatest planks of deterrence, that the adversary knows that we can do that. So those are two of the areas, Mark. You might want to talk about others.
Thanks. I'm really glad you brought up sector risk management agencies. I think the shift from sector-specific agency to sector risk management agency really explains to those federal agencies what their responsibility is in these in the public-private collaboration between the federal government and our 60 national critical infrastructures, and that risk management part's critical in helping CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, build its national risk management. But you did mention the critical, SRMA, and it makes me think about critical infrastructures, and we have 16 of them, and no one ever likes to say which of their children they like the most or least. But if I could ask you, which critical infrastructure worries you the most when you think about the security and trustworthiness of ICS? So Samantha, if you could take us through which of those critical infrastructures worries you the most.
Sure. I'll give everyone a hint. All right. It's what I'd be drinking out of this bottle, because so water. But first let me back up. so I stepped on my line. But in our ICT white paper, we also called out that similar efforts for supply chain resilience, for intel threat sharing are needed for other operational technologies that control, power, water, transportation, other critical infrastructure sectors, as well as unique production areas like medical devices, weapon systems. They fell somewhat out of scope out of our ICS white paper, but many of the materials and components, including semiconductors, are integral to such critical technologies more broadly. Okay, but to answer your question directly, water security, terrifies me, right? Water security or lack thereof. A lot of attention goes to the energy sector, and that is right. That is important. But frankly, in some respects, especially just as an average citizen, you can live without the lights on for a bit, but try to live without water for even a few days. And recent events show that our adversary knows this, right? There are increasing awareness to the vulnerabilities in our water infrastructure. The Oldsmar, Florida attack in February demonstrated a system with numerous basic cyber hygiene processes not being followed. The ease with which even an inexperienced hacker could alter the performance of automated production and chemical balancing systems. Look, this was a significant incident that almost occurred. It barely was avoided, luckily, and barely was avoided. So, and continuing that, I mean, water infrastructure has also been a part of a number of ransomware attacks directed at local municipalities in the US, right? So these attacks can prevent access to the control of water generation or distribution until a ransom is paid. So I think we are seeing more and more about these attacks on a soft underbelly of a critical infrastructure that up until now hasn't had the focus. And water is a critical, everyone gets thirsty whenever I talk about this. I just noticed Gallagher taking everyone, because you realize, like, you need this. It's a critical lifeline, critical infrastructure. It's key to our economic and national security. But for a lot of reasons, it lacks fundamental investments in cyber defenses. I think the number is right, although it's something like this, that there are 70,000 water utilities in the United States, right? When you compare that to bulk power, so there are about 3,000-ish bulk power utilities in the United States. There are 3,000 water utilities in California alone. And they run the gamut from really, really small to medium to large, but there are a lot more small and medium than there are on the electricity side of the fence. And their budgets are constrained. They got solo bill of goods years ago, just, buy this, piece of technology. Oh, by the way, it was made in China. Stick it in your system. You can fire people and monitor from afar. Who knows about changing passwords or anything? And now we wake up to this real issue. It's a very different condition than other lifeline infrastructures, such as energy, financial services, telecom, where cybersecurity, while it's not perfect by any means, has significantly had more attention paid to it. And again, not perfect. Cybersecurity has in some ways started to be built into the basic hardware and software. Right? That is not yet the case by and large in water infrastructure. So both industry, which is composed of largely small, as I said, local municipalities, and the US government, represented by the EPA, have not kept up with the increasing risk driven by the automation of water production and distribution systems. A significant effort by both sides of the public-private partnership is absolutely needed to reduce the vulnerability. So where I think we'd press to have the efforts focused, obviously basic cyber hygiene, improve operator training, raise threat awareness. And look, most expensively, but maybe most critically, we have to modernize insecure systems, right? whether part is rip and replace, part is an overlay, but it is absolutely critical. So the Solarium Commission is studying a number of possible legislative solutions. These include incentivizing cybersecurity investments with grants and low-income loans. Again, think about who owns and manages these utilities. I live out in the country in Virginia. These are small places. Increased access to cyber threat information, especially though for the larger municipalities who can kind of incorporate that threat information into their operations. As I said, improved cyber hygiene training programs, working with equipment manufacturers to build more cybersecurity into the as-delivered machinery. So, if you haven't figured it out already, the threat to water is increasing exponentially, and the response of federal government and the owners and operators of the water authorities must match the effort on the front that is being thrown at by the adversaries. So there it is.
Thanks. I appreciate that detailed answer. I'm passionate about water as well, and I was excited to see Senator Duckworth got Senate 914, which is it's a Safe Drinking Water Act through the Senate. I think it was a pretty sizable win, like 98-2, kind of bipartisan pass. And so I hope an equivalent bill in the House will kind of tackle this issue. It does have, this has a lot of money in it that isn't cyber, and that's fine. That's recognizable. The water industry is more than cybersecurity. But I saw at least 110, $120 million worth of cybersecurity in there, which is critical and would be such an increase over what the EPA is normally providing grants. I know the Department of Agriculture does a little bit for water, quite a bit for the water associated with farms. But I have to say, I think when the commission looked at this, there was a sense of disappointment in the government's work over the last 23 years on cybersecurity. And I know EPA deals with a lot of challenging political issues, but cybersecurity appears, to not have been a priority. And so the degree to which the Congress can assist the executive branch in making it a priority could go a long way to make our water more secure. And as you know, we've talked about this in the committee. In fact, we had a dystopian start to our report about water, and the idea that if you went around the country in 3 or 4 spots and created poor chemistry, that caused young people or old people to become ill, and it all happened simultaneously, and with the social media and the press, people would lose confidence in the credibility of their water supply, because people don't know whether or not they can sense whether water is good or not. They're pretty sure when power is good or not. It's on, it's off, or it's starting a fire, right? But with water, people don't understand that if the pH has changed dramatically, you can tell. So they'll lose confidence and credibility in it. And there's not enough plastic water sold at Target or Costco to make up for a loss of credibility in that system.
Yeah, and let me just very quickly just add to that. One of I think the great things about Solarium, we always kept the average citizen in mind as we were working through these very high level strategic discussions where we need to go as a government, as what Congress needs to legislate, big business. But at the heart of it, it is securing the prosperity and the health of our fellow citizens. And you're right, Mark, and when we think about these smaller water utilities, right, who are really, again, they're not in any position to know that, hey, something funky is on a sensor every Monday morning at 10 a.m. That seems normal. Well, maybe not. Maybe 10 a.m. is when the adversary on Monday, attacks the system. But they don't have the training, they don't have the capability, they don't have the sensor awareness. But it's on the back of us to help them get there, because we're talking tens of millions of Americans are put in harm's way because of this.
Thanks. And I'll get to Representative Gallagher, thinking about the future still, and thinking about what you and Representative Langevin will be doing in the House, working with the NDAA over the next 3 to 4 months. What legislation are you two considering in 2021 that might address these kind of issues head on?
Yeah, well, quickly, let me just maybe foot stomp everything that Dr. Ravitch and you said on the water issues. I come from a district where we've had some water issues, and it's really hard to overstate just the chaos that would ensue if you really started messing with people's water supply and the lack of confidence that that would produce. So I just really appreciate the detailed way in which Sam went through all of that. I think it's an area we're not paying enough attention to, and I just really commend the discussion both of you had on that, because it's really important to my constituents. To your question, I would expect a few things. First, this issue of critical technology security centers. One of the commission's proposals would appropriate funds for the executive branch to select, designate, and fund up to 3 critical technology centers that would centralize efforts in evaluating and testing common technologies such as ICS in critical infrastructure. The second thing is a concept that was mentioned earlier, that of systemically important critical infrastructure, SICI as we're calling it. SICI legislation would create a process by which DHS designates certain critical infrastructure as systemically important, and then those entities would have both the benefits from the federal government, intelligence sharing, liability protection, but also additional burdens such as security certification, incident reporting requirements, and then some entities would include critical infrastructure that makes use of ICS and SCADA systems as well. So the third thing that comes to mind is the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority, legislation that would direct the executive branch to hold a competitive bid for a nonprofit, non-governmental organization to be designated and funded as the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority, and this organization would then establish and manage a voluntary cybersecurity certification and labeling program for ICS devices. So those are some of the 3 forward-leaning proposals we have. In addition, I would just say, given that we passed a lot of legislation at the end of the last Congress, we as a commission have an interest in conducting oversight of the executive branch in general and of the National Cyber Director and of CISA in particular to ascertain whether that legislation helped, whether it is doing what we expect it to do, things such as giving CISA the authority to do threat hunting on .gov networks, whether that would have actually helped not necessarily prevent, but perhaps detect earlier a SolarWinds intrusion. And so I think a lot of our work is going to be just basic oversight and review of past successes to see where we hit the mark and where we may have missed it a little bit, if that makes sense.
It does, and I know you and I aren't allowed to go into the specifics of it, but you and Representative Langevin, I think we can say basically, broadly, just submitted a letter with over 50 specific appropriations requests associated with executing last year's 27 NDA provisions, somewhat across multiple agencies, and the way the appropriation subcommittees work. You had to do multiple ones, but I would say what you and Representative Langevin did there, and I know you and Senator King are considering the same thing in the Senate. It's a different timeline. I think that's another version of oversight, making sure things are properly appropriated.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it pains me to admit that the appropriators have all the power as an authorizer, and I won't burden you with my more radical non-Solarium recommendations on how we might fix that basic division in Congress and collapse the appropriations committees into the authorizing committees. But yeah, it's, you see it with National Cyber Director. We established sort of the authorized framework for it, but we need to make sure that that position is adequately resourced to do the very important job we're asking it to do. Now, we're very lucky to have someone nominated for that position who I think will do a phenomenal job if confirmed, who comes from the commission, Chris Inglis, and I'm very excited about that. But we in Congress need to ensure, since we were the prime movers for that, that we're giving the NCD the resources it needs to be successful.
Yes, sir. And he's given away one. There's 49 others. But for Dr. Ravitch, Representative Gallagher mentioned 3 of our big, particularly with SICI, our biggest recommendations for next year and how they might tie into ICS. You earlier mentioned a provision about the National Supply Chain Intelligence Center. Can you go into that in a little greater detail?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this back up, because it's unbelievably important that we stop only playing defense, right? We are not getting ahead of the adversary strategy, right? So at best, we're playing defense. We're waiting for the next attack to come in, and we're hoping we can stop the shot on goal, but we have to get better at knowing and thwarting the attacks currently being planned, from Moscow, from Beijing against us. And to get ahead of strategic surprise. And by the way, that's the #1 mission of the US intelligence community, right? Avoid strategic surprise. We have to get better intelligence. So, okay, so think about it this way. The problem statement of why we need a national supply chain intelligence center. The US and its partners, we may be able to decouple from China. We may not be able to fully decouple from adversaries like China, but we are certainly going to continue to source critical components and technologies from countries within the reach of adversaries, right? So to better protect critical technology supply chains, the US government has to work with allies and partners, private sector, to improve its capability to both collect and disseminate intelligence on supply chain risks. The information, by the way, is critical not only to government agencies, of course, but to private sector, sector stakeholders. They own and operate 85% of the nation's critical infrastructure. And so, there's a lot that they can do. It's amazing what business has done over the last 20 years on know your customer, know your vendor, but there's only so much they can do. They are not intelligence gathering agencies. They're private businesses that are making something for the benefit of all of us. To put it on their back that they have to know how many layers down a supply chain when adversaries are purposely obfuscating, I would say that help has to come from the US government, and the US intelligence community has to be at the pointy edge of that stick at tasking collectors, at potentially building new types of collection platforms. But to make sure they do that correctly, on the front part of this equation, they have to be able to gather the information to understand where the threat is moving. So without the information, let me restate, to fully understand the risks, the private sector is not going to be able to implement comprehensive strategies to address the potential for compromise. So this is our proposal, right? That Congress should direct the president to construct or designate a national supply chain intelligence center. And the center, which could take the form of either a new or existing structure, should be designed to integrate supply chain intelligence efforts from across the federal government with those of the public and private partners, and should serve as the central and shared knowledge resource for threats to supply chain activities or supply chain integrity. And as part of the process of creating the center, Congress should direct the president to conduct a review of existing intelligence authorities for major departments and agencies, and assess whether any departments and agencies currently lacking Title 15 intelligence authorities should be granted them. Because the pieces of the puzzle are very disparate, right? And as we have talked about for this last however many, almost an hour, there are pockets of information, but there has to be a central locus to bring those in, assess it, and understand then on the outside to where do we task future collection, new platforms for potential collection. So again, to get ahead of what the adversary is planning 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line.
Thanks. And just one quick question, because people might be confused. We had previously had a recommendation on a cyber threat intel integration center that's actually located at DNI. Is this the same thing, or is it somewhat different from that?
Well, it's somewhat different because this specifically calls out, supply chain intelligence, right? So it is a narrow focus on this very critical and important matter.
Okay, thanks. That's great. And the supply chain, it will be interesting is the supply chain recommendations are going to have to flow through the Commerce Committee generally. You know, our most of our supply chain ones, it'll be, I'm sure there'll be referrals to Intel and Armed Services and others and Homeland Security, but it's going to be an interesting path to confirmed or to pass legislation. For Representative Gallagher here, now we've talked a lot about the commission recommendations and a lot about the executive branch, but why do you think it's necessary for Congress to be such a critical part of the solution when we look at ICS security and trustworthiness?
Well, I mean, if I were going to put my my constitutional hat on, I would say at the broadest level, because Congress is intended to be the dominant branch of government. I'm sure my friends in the executive branch would have a different view of that, and certainly it's not currently the case when it comes to national security in particular, but that's a longer story we don't need to get into. But on a more practical level, I would say, as we've seen over the past 2 administrations where we've had changeovers, executive orders alone, even when they're well-intentioned and well-reasoned, can come and go, and we can end up kind of bouncing back and forth between wildly different interpretations of U.S. policy, and that creates chaos. Certainly from the private sector perspective, it's hard to deal with that level of chaos, and so legislative provisions that have the force of law can allow the private sector to make reasonable risk reduction decisions when they have legislative guidance. They have more permanence than executive orders. Congress can also appropriate resources to help affect solutions when programs and support efforts have been authorized. Congress still imperfectly wields the power of the purse. And so I think there's a variety of reasons you want Congress involved. And then I think if you start to dig in, excuse me, to some recommendations like that of the National Cyber Director, really what we're aiming for is a productive partnership between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And we want to not only force the executive branch to prioritize certain things that we think are important, to effectuate a cultural shift whereby the executive branch is actively reaching out to the private sector, adding value to the private sector, not just demanding information from the private sector, but also to incentivize members of Congress to prioritize cybersecurity, to make this really a discipline that legislators are interested in and invest their oversight time in and develop some level of expertise in. And so in our original report, that's why we recommend the creation of a select committee on cyber in Congress. So I think there's a variety of reasons you want Congress to be more actively engaged in cyber than it is right now. And that's why the commission is working hard. We've mentioned a number of provisions that if passed would improve ICS security, along with a number of motivated congressional committees. We are working to develop legislative solutions and push them through any legislative vehicle possible. We're not just tied to the NDAA, but really to any bipartisan, bicameral effort. And I guess my note of optimism is that I just, even in the last year and a half that I've been engaged in this, sensed a lot of increased interest among my colleagues in Congress who genuinely want to get smart in cyber and want to learn more about it and want to be involved in it. But it's not something that I think rewards casual involvement. It's something where we're going to need a lot of members of Congress to dedicate a lot of time and to get the committees that have overlapping jurisdiction to work better together. So hopefully that made some sense, Mark.
Yeah, you just described like the hardest piece of jujitsu in government, which is getting overlapping congressional committees to agree to a consensual bill. But I think you're right. I think our success last year was anchored in you and Representative Langevin and then Senator King, Senator Sass being able to sponsor, rapidly sponsor a large number of floor amendments that we were then able to move into the NDAA and get conference through, and that reflects one of the advantages the commission was having the 4 commissioners who were active legislators. Samantha, if I could ask you one follow-up. You'd mentioned earlier, you'd mentioned energy and it being we'll be careful. It's not everything's not perfect in energy, but it's certainly of the lifeline infrastructures has one of the strongest private-public collaboration efforts going on. One that I saw on that you're running at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies or assisting with is the Department of Energy's OT Fellowship Program. Can you talk about that for a few minutes?
Yeah, so this came about a couple years ago. I was speaking at a cyber conference out in Colorado, and during the break, I was talking to a operational technology defender from one of the big grid operators, and we just got to speaking, and you know, he was talking about how OT and IT traditionally, I love this phrase, have drank at different bars. That's what he said to me. And you know, so I kind of dig down into that, and he said, look, you know, in the past we had very different systems. We, you know, had you know, OT, you know, we'd stay for 40 years. We knew these systems like our children. You know, we'd you know, have to. It was very idiosyncratic, and the IT was changing all the time. And but the last mile and things, you know, IoT and IIoT have kind of merged some of this. And then he said, but the problem is, he said, well, we, the OT folks, don't seem to get the love from the federal government that the IT folks get in terms of understanding where threat is and how it's moving and where we're and how to defend against this. So I kind of molded over and took this back to the Department of Energy and said, hey, you know, y'all should fund a program that that brings together OT defenders from major energy, oil, gas, electricity operators, and get them to know one another, but also get them to know what the federal government is doing and can doing, and share direction bi-directionally. So DOE tapped Idaho National Lab, the great Idaho National Lab. It's fantastic. If you're in Idaho, you should go visit if they let you. But we had our first session in a month or two ago. We had the inaugural 11 fellows from companies like Southern Company and Occidental Petroleum and Duke and Boardwalk and Nextera. I mean, really brand name companies. And they sent a high-level OT defender. And so the first session was in Idaho, and the next two hopefully are going to be in the National Capital Region, meeting with folks from NSA and FBI and DHS and ODNI to know what their role is as part of what the US government is understanding on where the threat is moving. But again, really sharing information back and forth. Hey, OT defender, where do you see the threat? You know, hey, big company, you're about to invest a lot of money into battery capacity. How do you understand the threats to your supply chain at batteries? Because does it run through China? What can you do to defend against it? So these are the kind of things. It's a fantastic program, DOE OT Defender. I think you can log on and take a look at it. But yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that we have to do more of.
Hey, thanks, Samantha. And you know, just because we have a few minutes, it's always fun. Senator King sometimes, you know, talks about the history of the Solarium Commission. He has several versions of it, and I think it'd be exciting. I know Representative Gallagher only has one version. If you could talk a little bit, just because it's an interesting historical tidbit, what's the differences and similarities between what we did and what the Eisenhower Solarium was?
Well, I should note that my argument about sort of the value of Solarium is not the generally accepted one among the obscure group of 5 Cold War historians that actually care about this, because there is an ongoing debate as to whether Solarium actually influenced Eisenhower's thinking or whether he sort of fixed the game in order to generate support for a grand strategic approach that he had already decided on prior to the exercise. Now, I do think one of the primary values of the original exercise, where you had these sort of 3 competitive teams, each charged with developing an alternative strategy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, was to generate consensus where it didn't exist prior to the process. And it really wasn't just Solarium itself, it was the months after the exercise was done, where the NSC was tasked with reconciling all the differences. And Eisenhower on July 16th, 1953, after all the teams had presented, you know, made this presentation where he talked about a surprising amount of consensus among the teams, but that was not the mood in the room at the time. And there was a lot of people that were concerned about the lack of consensus and spent a lot of months afterwards generating consensus. And I think that leads to the biggest difference between the original Project Solarium and our exercise. We recognized from the start that this was not a presidentially driven exercise, right? We had great participation from the executive branch, really thoughtful contributions. We would not have been able to finish our report without it, but this was a congressionally driven exercise. And so we really tried to make that a feature, not a bug of the process, and really generate a final product that was geared towards legislation as opposed to kind of grand strategy and influencing the president's decision making, which is what the original exercise was all about. And then I would say, you know, I think the thing people get wrong about Solarium when they revisit it is this idea that somehow, you know, after the process, you know, Eisenhower just marched forth with the new look NSC 162-2, and that was set in stone for the 8 years of his administration. Obviously, that was not the case. I mean, he faced a multitude of strategic shocks, the Suez crisis, Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, some shocks in the later part of his administration, and he was forced to adjust. He was forced to revisit certain assumptions that they had relied upon in Solarium. And similarly, I mean, I think we've developed a framework for layered cyber deterrence, but we're not suggesting that we've answered any question. And certainly we're going to learn things as the threat environment evolves, as the federal government reforms itself. And there are probably some areas where, you know, we didn't even spend sufficient time examining certain hypotheses. So I don't know, a lot of similarities and differences. You know, I think, you know, at least in terms of our outside experts like Dr. Ravitch, we could plausibly say that we had the brightest national security minds of the day, as they did back in 1953. But I certainly brought down the mean level of IQ and intelligence in a way that I think that, you know, it puts us at a disadvantage relative to the original project.
Well, I do think in the red teams, in the commissioners, you're right, are 6 subject matter kind of expert appointed commissioners from the outside. We got a lot of expertise, but also the decision to bring on a red team, you know, by Senator King and yourself brought us, you know, 20 really, you know, leading lights, including Dmitry Alperovich, who's been on another panel, you know, today with Hack the Capitol and others. So I think we really benefited from that. It does remind me, I mean, we're at the end here with 2 minutes left. At first, I think you set a high bar for Jim Langevin coming on about congressional members' knowledge of history. Hopefully he'll hit one in his upcoming talk. But I do want to bring together one thought, which is that as we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about ICS, you know, we have mentioned all 3 legs of the stool. There's a technology leg. You have to get the technology right. Those critical technology centers we're advocating for next year seems like low-hanging fruit, but those kind of investments, and they hook into Samantha's comment in the national labs, you know, done in the national labs where you can really push forward on working the technology. That's important. The policies and processes, getting the relationship right between the public-private collaboration, the continuity of the economy that was mentioned, that's critical. And then finally, the people. You know, the investment in the people part, you know, and this isn't just about, you know, buying federal government workers through like scholarship for service, but the OT fellowship program is about making mid-career OT experts, you know, more wise and knowledgeable about everything that's going on in other private sector and in the government. So if you can bring together technology, kind of processes and policy and people and get all 3 legs together, we'll be in good shape. So Representative Mike Gallagher, Dr. Samantha Ravitch, appreciate your support, your service to your country on the commission, and your participation in today's exercise. I'll pass it back over now to Bryson.
Solarium.gov. You didn't give the Solarium.gov. Read the executive summary. If you're not going to read anything else, it's brilliant. Mike Gallagher, Angus King. It is absolutely brilliant. Easily read. It's fantastic.
The only thing it's missing is its own T-shirt.
There we go. Yeah. Well, we're a government organization. There could be none of that.
Yeah.
If it's under the gift threshold, you know.
Oh, that shirt's under $25.
Okay, good. I'll proudly wear that.
I'll get one sent over to your office.
Thank you.